Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third annual Sustainability Week Countdown to COP28. Today, we are joined by an esteemed panel for a discussion on sustainable food systems to feed future generations. My name is Pratima Singh, and I'm a principal with the Policy and Insights team at Economist Impact. I want to start off our discussion today by introducing our panel. We have Didier Toubia, co-founder and chief executive, Aleph Farms; Matt Chlebek, co-founder and Harvest London. Hi, Didier. Hi, Matt. And finally, we have Laurent-David Charbit, co-head of private equity Regenerative Agriculture Fund at Tikehau Capital.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us, everyone, today. It's great to have you join this discussion, and we're very keen to hear everyone's thoughts and stories and insights as we talk about a very important topic: sustainable food systems. A couple of things that we want to discuss today would be: what would a sustainable food system look like? What do we need to do to build one? And how would things like regulation and supply chains need to be, change and also be affected and effective within planetary boundaries to really create a sustainable food system? So we're here to discuss the future of food, and we want to look and to talk about very concrete examples, information and practical insights, whether it's examples of projects and initiatives that have measurable, verifiable, replicable, and scalable impact that we can really share with the audience that's joining us today. One of the interesting things about a panel like this is that we get to hear different perspectives. We get to hear from different stakeholder groups, and particularly across different parts of the agriculture and food value chain. It's very important that we understand how the different stages of the value chain come together to be able to ensure that the entire ecosystem is sustainable and also can create change and do good going forward. So with that, I'd like to start and get us started really at the beginning of the agri-food value chain, and maybe asking a relatively broad and general question, but something that's very focused on solving the problem, because we all know that sustainable food systems are what we want to achieve by the end of it. But what are some of the innovative solutions that we're seeing at the production stage of the value chain, and how can we sort of share a little bit more about how this has come to be? So Didier, I'd love to start the conversation with you. If you could sort of lead us into what are some of those innovative solutions you're seeing?
Thank you, Pratima. Actually, we are currently making food and agricultural products basically on the same methods we used to feed 1.6 billion people at the turn of the previous century. And we've been optimizing the same, species, crops, farming practices for more output, to a scale where we've been losing biodiversity. We've been overusing our natural resources, land, water. And we're currently in a state where we really need to rethink the whole food system to adapt it to the population on planet Earth while coming back into our planetary boundaries. And to do that, we believe that we need two kinds of innovations. First, we need to innovate within the existing production systems and transit toward more regenerative agricultural practices. I believe Laurent-David will talk about it as well. Which is a great solution for crops, fruits, vegetables. Regenerative agriculture is not necessarily suitable for feeding 8 billion people with animal proteins and fats. Actually, we need 50 times more land to farm a cattle in a regenerative practice than with the current concentrated operations for animal farming. So beside regenerative agriculture, we also need new production systems, primarily for proteins and fats, which might be either in the field of cellular agriculture, meaning cultivating cells from animals as a new source, a new supply of animal products, which is what Aleph Farms is doing with the first application in the cultivated meat products, which is equivalent to a steak, actually, which we grow to make it simple outside of the animal with a fraction of the resources, with a commitment to be net zero by 2025 and the ability to distribute the production of those proteins to make the system more resilient. It might be in the form of algae-based solutions or precise fermentation, maybe insects. And so we do see these two groups of innovations making the current food system more sustainable, resilient, and new production systems as complementary. Obviously, this second group of innovative products is at an earlier stage. We see some products gaining more acceptance recently. As far as cellular agriculture is concerned, the leading companies, including Aleph Farms, are in the process of launching first products and at initial phases of scaling up. The technology works. We're still working on a scale up, cost reduction, and making those solutions affordable to the mass market.
Thanks very much, Didier. That's very interesting, and thank you for structuring it in very clear terms with, regen ag and other existing sort of mechanisms, other mechanisms within the existing space, and then of course complementary angle there, which is innovative technologies. Matt, would you like to add anything before I ask Laurent-David to jump in on regen?
I think in terms of what we do specifically at our company, I mean we're a vertical farming company, so we grow crops indoors essentially under lights year round. But the reason we're doing what we do is to try and tackle the issues that we face in the UK, which is we import a lot of our fresh fruit and vegetables. So we're trying to grow more of that here, as locally as we can within the UK. And there's also a lot of waste that comes with that importation as well, which we sort of feel we can tackle. And then there's also this other look at sort of reducing or improving the efficiency of the inputs that are put in. So whether that's recapturing the water or being more efficient with fertilizer use, because agriculture is sort of open field agriculture is sort of notoriously bad for being a cause of waterway pollution with fertilizer runoff. So, we're trying to we're not trying to compete with the current methods of production. We're just trying to improve them, and in some cases, obviously, sort of replace things like importing. I think where I see, in the future, I think there are certain things. It's interesting that we've got someone like Didier here from Aleph Farms. There's been talking to a lot of people recently about using plants in novel ways, not just to feed the population, but also using plants to be the sort of production facility for things like novel proteins and as the inputs for whether that's cultivated meat or biologic drugs. And so I think there's just a lot of ways out there we can use the kind of technology that we're using to apply that to different methods of production, not just food. But really, for us, we're just trying to tackle the sort of immediate inefficiencies that are there, especially, here in the UK, as we're an island and we have to bring a lot of stuff in. We don't always have the best weather around here. So we're trying to sort of tackle those immediate solves, but there are actually a lot of things in the future. And I think we'll come on to later as well, sort of some of the questions that might be asked later on this about how we see vertical farming fitting in with UK governmental policies, especially around sustainability.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think the weather angle, the UK weather is not always the best, is quite something. But
yes, and we also rely on countries that have great weather but have been having problems of their own, which means our supply chain's also disrupted as well.
I do want to talk about supply chains. I think that's an interesting point, and specifically also the point you mentioned, which is just reducing supply chain lengths across and thinking about like scalability of that. But before we do that, Laurent-David, I'd love to turn to you. I know we've been talking about regenerative agriculture and what can we do better within the existing system. I'd love to be able to hear your thoughts on that as well.
On the regen ag, maybe good to define the regen ag as Didier was mentioning it, and we define regen ag as a few guiding principles. The first one is really to reduce tillage, put less fertilizer or crop protection, which are damaging the water and the biodiversity. also soil protection, bringing back the animal closer to the farm, enhance biodiversity. And of course, all that has to be done in sync with the area of farming you are at. You are not going to farm in the UK where you have a fantastic weather in the same way that you would do it, in Brazil. So this being said, we see, because agriculture is everywhere in the world, a lot of innovation in that space. Maybe I can share with you a few, which we think are quite interesting. In the crop protection, there are massive innovation currently, because regulation in many countries is asking to really switch to less, impactful, negative impact on the externalities, and things to have a bit less chemical base. That will be in crop protection. In seeds, also very, very promising, the use of AI implementation to reduce the time to market of new seeds, as well as the cost, because time to market for seeds it can be between 10 and 13 years, and the cost can be like multi-hundred of millions of dollars of development. So AI would definitely help in that space. Another area which is a key for Regen Ag would be the farming equipment. Is how do you farm and reduce tillage? So we see some innovation here. And last but not least, all what you do, you have to demonstrate the impact, because at the end, only impact does count. And having companies being innovative on measuring the soil health is key, and soil health can be measured in many ways. So, but we see a lot of innovation in that space, and what is even more important is the scale of the innovation and the fact that it can be done at scale in many places. So that's maybe the four areas as an example.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for that. I think that, one, defining it, of course, and we've got an entire discussion on Regen Ag coming up as well. And then we've got, talking specifically about different aspects of this, whether it's equipment, seeds, soil health, of course. And one thing that you said at the end, which was really important, is the measurable impact, right? How do we measure this? Can we say, therefore, that is the right solution? That's the more sustainable solution for the long term. And I know that that's something that policymakers and governments are thinking about a lot as well, which is how do we understand the impact of this, therefore, so that we can also pass regulation, which brings me to the regulation point of things. Particularly as it relates to some of these innovative technologies, right? We're talking about cellular innovation. We're talking about vertical farms, Matt. We're talking about, AI in reducing the times for seeds to germinate, essentially. So can we think a little bit more about what is the role of regulation, particularly as you see it from your different industries and your specific industries, in ensuring that this is something that actually can be, taken off the ground, but then also sustained over the long term. So does anyone want to kick us off? Matt, you? Laurent-David, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I can continue on that. So we see the role of regulation to be twofold. The first one would be to set the rules of the game, by really defining the common playground, and base leveling the area, because it does help, if you have a set of rules that for everyone to invest on the long term, because all we're talking about is about transformation, whatever the area we are in, and you can really do transformation and invest accordingly only if you have a bit of visibility on the regulation. So that will be the first one. The second expectation from the role of the regulator, agriculture is a heavily subsidized sector across the world. It can go from countries where it's 5% in the ANZ zone of Brazil, up to 40% of the farmer revenue in Japan, South Korea, or Switzerland would be from the subsidies. And having the regulator tagging, and flagging the signal, changing the allocation of the subsidies based on the change of practices is definitely a way to drive the right behavior, because it does matter. This is not, the subsidies, I tend to say, they are not cherry on the cake in many countries. They are a large piece of the cake, and therefore that's the best way to drive behavior.
That's interesting. I do want to come back to subsidizing the right practices, because that's something that we've heard of as a solution quite a bit. Matt, you mentioned regulation, so I'd like to turn to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's in the UK, I think there's probably 3. I just remembered one; it was 2, and then I've just remembered another one. It's probably 3 governmental policies, either upcoming or that have sort of been passed recently, that I think are important to us. Again, I think the way the UK produces food isn't currently a particularly sustainable system, or the way the UK feeds its population, and we sort of. I think the first thing, which is a more general point, is this year there was the Precision Breeding Act passed, which allows the sort of development and deployment of precision bred crops. I mean, my background's a plant geneticist, so it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. I think deploying these precision bred crops will help us in the short term. Things, the climate change is obviously a real thing, and it does have an effect on crop yields in open fields. And hopefully, with something like the Precision Breeding Act, we can start being able to tackle that with much more sort of haste. With our industry as well, the government here wants to decarbonise the electric grid by, I think it's 2035, and alongside that, there's problems in the UK, in that renewable energy is linked in some ways to the price of non-renewable energy, which is a bit of a problem. But if we can decarbonise the grid in the UK and move to an 100% renewable grid, I think that's beneficial for everyone. It's very beneficial for us because it kind of allows us to place a farm doing local production anywhere we want if the grid is 100% renewable. And then on a sort of a less public scale, but I think one that's also important, is the UK government is also trying to move all agriculture is the wrong word, but all sort of professional production of crops to a peat-free methodology by 2030. We've sort of never worked with peat as a product, but we, as a result, know a lot of people that are basically creating alternative substrates for use in glass houses, for use in vertical farms, for use in plant nurseries. And so removing the peat out of the chain, again, is sort of hopefully a beneficial thing, whether that's with wood fibre or whether that's with jute fibres or any of these other different alternatives. So those sort of 3 things are kind of what we see sort of government intervention being a beneficial thing.
Yeah, I think the energy discussion is also really critical, right? Especially in markets like the UK, but generally across. There's an energy, water, food nexus really in this situation, and being able to ensure that regulation, links all of these and is effective across all 3 can be important. Otherwise, you'd have adverse or unforeseen consequences. Didier, could I pass to you to talk a little bit about what we were, just thinking about with regulation?
Sure. It's a very large topic, and all the points which have been mentioned are all good. I think that there are a couple of other angles which are worth mentioning. The first one is about carbon reduction. We have very strict goals in Europe, in the US as well, and many countries for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we can't do that without rethinking the way we manage our food system. The food system today is responsible for 32% of all the greenhouse gases emitted every year. And the majority, 54% of the methane emitted, which is a bigger issue than CO2. And I think that, we're off our targets and off curve in terms of the reduction of greenhouse gases. We don't make enough progress here because those reductions are primarily voluntary carbon reductions, and the carbon markets are not standardized, not regulated enough. So I think it's one way to drive the transformation of the food system is to better regulate the carbon space, both in terms of legal framework for carbon emissions and carbon emission reductions, which would be not just voluntary, and better regulation of carbon market to be able to enforce some of those goals. The other aspect of regulation, which relates more to the innovative products, I was talking about cell-based food, for instance, which is what we do, or insects, precise fermentation, vertical farming as well. Is that those products, vertical farming maybe not, but the novel protein products are usually what is called novel food in Europe and in many other countries, and are usually going through a very strict and thorough safety assessment process, which is necessary, I believe, to build the trust with the consumer. On the other hand, many regulatory agencies don't necessarily have the resources, the bandwidth, the focus on promoting the approvals of those new products. So we see on one hand, the policymakers which are calling for innovation. On the other hand, the different Ministry of Health or EFSA in Europe or in the UK, the FSA is very proactive and willing to approve new products, but have limited resources. And we need to open this bottleneck, allocate more resources, provide access to external advisors, and maybe define a strategic path within the regulatory agencies, same as it has been done in Israel. In Israel, we're part of a pilot program, which is a pool of resources between the Israel Innovation Authority, which is equivalent to the UKRI in the UK, and the Ministry of Health, to allocate more resources and accelerate the review of those files. So we're not talking here about cutting corners or easing the requirements. We're talking about allocating more resources and building accelerated paths for products which are strategic to reaching our goals in transforming the food system.
Yeah, that's a really good note. And I want to have a follow-up question for you there. But of course, Matt, Laurent-David, if you have others, feel free to jump in as I ask this question. But Didier, you mentioned Israel, of course. I also know in terms of novel protein, Singapore is one of the markets that has been very at the forefront of, easing regulations on this. Do you see regulation becoming more favorable as we sort of look ahead the next maybe 8 to 12 months, or do you think it's going to take a lot more? Because there is a lot of skepticism with which consumers see novel proteins, but at the same time, regulation is catching up. I think there have been some of these little sort of spaces where we've seen progress. But I want to ask Didier this, but of course, Matt, Laurent-David, if you have some opinions, I'd be keen to hear that as well.
Yes, definitely. I think that there is a very strong willingness to improve the regulatory processes and the safety assessment activities around issues which are strategic, such as novel proteins. And we've seen some initiatives, as you mentioned, in Singapore, in Israel. There are some, again, a lot of interest in promoting those products from the regulatory agencies, not only to fulfill, macroeconomic goals in terms of driving a more sustainable and secure food system, but also in terms of reducing the use of antibiotics, for instance. Antimicrobial resistance is one of the big public health issues in a lot of countries, and the massive use of antibiotics at concentrated operations for animal farming is a big public health issue. And there are other benefits of some of the novel protein production systems in terms of traceability and transparency of the production, which is sometimes difficult to reach with conventional animal farming. We can also help avoiding zoonotic diseases. Currently in Europe, there are 7 virus strains with high zoonotic potential, only within the avian agricultural production system, meaning in poultry, and that's also a big issue. So, there are a lot of benefits to novel proteins beyond just sustainability, which are very important for the regulatory agencies which are responsible for public health, and working hand in hand with them to help them building the right frameworks to achieve a common goal.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think very interesting to hear about the role of regulation and also linking it to consumers and the end users, I guess, in this case. We've talked a little bit about production and, the initial part of the supply chain. We've talked a very high level, but talked a little bit about, the role of regulation in consumers, so to discuss that. But I do want to talk about the middle as well, which is supply chains. And Matt, I know you were alluding to this earlier, but talking about how do we build a sustainable supply chain in food, which is a whole other topic. But obviously, at Harvest Farms, you're doing local supply chains, at least in the UK. Is that the only solution? Do you think that's the most important solution? How would you sort of respond to that?
I think that all three of us here, or at least the sort of subjects that all three of us are covering here, sort of have the potential to decrease the length of the supply chain quite dramatically. In the immediate sense, it's just about the food security of a country and producing the product that the consumers want year round, or the consumers demand is year round, and producing that product as close to those consumers as possible. Whether that's with vertical farming for your vegetable, whether that's with alternative proteins and cultured meat for your meat and your proteins, or whether that's with regenerative agriculture, meaning that the land that is available to that country is as bountiful as possible, and isn't sort of farmed into oblivion. Focusing on those things allows us to shorten the length of supply chain, shorten air miles, shorten the amount of pollution caused by chilling things and shipping things, and all of these sort of quite obvious contributors to greenhouse emissions and to climate change. You can also go a little bit, for us specifically, we can go a little bit closer to the source by co-locating with energy generation facilities. I think once you hit a specific scale, that becomes more and more relevant, and it can allow you to sort of be a more circular system. So things like co-locating next to anaerobic digesters, which can produce power from your waste, and you can, for crops specifically, you can use the carbon dioxide that comes from them, and all these other sort of outputs. I think for agriculture as well, there's a big reliance on gas in this country for heating things like glass houses. It's actually quite astounding how much gas is used to keep glass houses warm in the winter, essentially. Again, because the demand is year round. If you lived in an ideal world, people would only eat cabbages in the winter and tomatoes in the summer, and only eat what's seasonal and what they can grow in their back garden. But that's just not the reality of it. So being able to decouple from gas for heating during the colder months is also what we see a really important part of the equation, because it's not just about it's not just about vertical farming for food production. It's about controlled environment agriculture as a whole, whether that's high-tech glass houses, whether that is vertical farming. And so we sort of see it as jigsaw puzzle pieces as part of the food production landscape, but a lot of them face the same problems. It's energy, where that energy comes from, and it's where it's created and how you get it to the consumer in the end. And then also there's a lot of waste in supermarkets, right? And it's because of the length of that supply chain. And the products that consumers are getting is of quite a poor standard, and it's a poor standard because of the way it's produced and how far away it is produced, and the demands on shelf life, which we feel as a business we can solve in a lot of those examples. So yeah, tackling waste as well is a big one.
Yeah, food loss and waste is really top of mind now, as it relates, of course, to supply chains, but also just directing food in the right way. Speaking of household waste here, but even at the retail level, it's huge. Laurent-David, you spent a lot of time looking at supply chains and procurement as well. Would you like to share a little bit and share your thoughts on creating that sustainable supply chain, if there's anything to add to what Matt said?
Yes, thank you. So typically when we say sustainable, we imply, or let's say I imply, lasting. Because to be lasting, there are three must-have that I would see is it has to have impact, an impact, positive impact. It has to be compatible with a social dimension, whether it's health or safety, and it has to be economical way of doing. If you have these three things combined, then we can ensure and building lasting supply chain. Quite often, as a fund manager, what we see is that we have companies coming with solution, but they are addressing one or two dimension their promise is to revolution or to change dramatically the value chain, but they address one or two only of this must-have, and that doesn't fly. And that's all, I think, what we should always have in mind. As far as the example, and what is interesting is the example also at scale. Maybe two I could share is the Mars example, with the Andean and 12.3, which has, trying to recoup and change the formerly grazed land and degraded land into a productive one for cocoa. So that's a good example of what has been done, in partnership, and that's what I like is in this example, is a partnership at scale, or what Nestle is aiming to transform, the dairy industry by reducing the carbon footprint. These are just two examples of a few examples about many others, but I would say really keep this 3 dimension.
That's great. Thank you for that. Very clear in terms of the impacts and how we classify them. You mentioned economic, of course, and also you talked about partnerships, and I think also coming back to something that I think Matt and Didier both mentioned earlier, which is just scale. And I think this is something that's kind of been part of the discussion quite a bit. And so feel free to be like, no, I vehemently disagree. But one of the things we know is that some of these solutions, particularly as it relates to really, innovative technologies, really advanced technologies, they're not cheap. They're expensive. And a lot of the times, of course, when we look at Europe and North America, farms are large and, you can kind of pilot some of these technologies and figure it out. But smallholders are a majority in terms of, farming in other parts of the world. But leaving aside smallholders even, but just generally, if we look at some of the investment that has to be made in these innovative technologies, it's expensive. So I guess my question to all three of you, my sort of last question before we summarize is, all of this seems really interesting and creative and innovative. How can we ensure that we can achieve scale in doing this? Because that's really, at the end of it, we talk about supply chains, we talk about managing loss, we talk about, productive ways of investing in land, but we need to do it at scale for it to be high impact. So Didier, could I start with you and just have your thoughts on how do we achieve scale to build that food that's more sustainable?
Sure, and it's a great question because we talk sometimes about food tech, and novel food technologies. And actually there's an internal tension within this term food tech, because food is a commodity, in 90% of the cases. And tech is innovation, and innovation is usually expensive. And how do you, put together innovation and expensive technologies together and incorporate them into a commodity market? That's a challenge which, many of the companies in this space are facing. And in our views, the way we're addressing it at Aleph Farms is at different levels. First, we need the right technologies and to plan for cost from day one, or even day -1, even before we start developing the technology, and making sure that we build a platform which is scalable and can reach our targets in terms of costs before even starting to invest and developing those platforms, which is not always the case, unfortunately, in some instances. I think it's also a matter of product strategy. I believe that cellular agriculture, meaning growing cells in a controlled environment, to a certain extent, Matt will tell, but is potentially kind of similar to some aspects of indoor and agriculture and vertical farming, where we need to the initial production cost would be higher than the equivalent conventional product. So we probably need to focus first on higher end products, which can justify a higher selling price as we get into the market, and as we scale and leverage economies of scale, of course, but also improve the production processes and technologies as we develop the next generations of products, progressively move toward the mass market. I'm thinking of, I think, a good analogy with the electric vehicles. If you're thinking about Tesla, which really drove this transition toward this new generation of electric vehicles, they started with a higher end product and progressively developed lower end products until they reached the mass market. And at the end of the day, to be successful, we also need to develop the right product strategy. And regarding the scale, I also want to mention that same as renewable energies, which have been mentioned before, solar panels were also very expensive 20 years ago, and today they're competitive in the energy market. We need to work together with the governments and the framework of public-private partnerships, and the governments have an incentive to support the scale of those technologies to drive the transition they're committed to. And we need the full dedication of those players in the space. And we also need to make sure that the innovative technologies and the food production system we're developing are integrated in the food system. And if we're talking about the protein sector, for instance, the protein sector is not one isolated, let's say, silo within the food system. It's integrated with a lot of different players and different verticals and very complex supply chain. I think that we can scale only if we fit into the current system. For instance, at Aleph Farms, we're working with the Cargill in the US, with 5 other large corporate partners in Europe, in Asia, in Israel. And same as with renewable energies, the trigger for renewable energies to become mainstream have been the large, incumbent legacy energy companies to step in. And today, the largest producers of renewable energies are NG, NL, or companies which are started with fossil fuel. We need the whole supply chain, the whole ecosystem to be fully integrated in an inclusive and just transition of this sector for it to happen.
Yeah, the just transition is critical, I'm sure. Matt, could I turn over to you? Last 3 minutes, though, but for you at least. Anything to add to Didier's comment?
I think Didier's totally right on the sort of on the concept of scale and the cost. I think the criticism maybe of what we do can be twofold. One is that it's just expensive to build initially, which I think is down to your business model and where the money is coming from and kind of how you structure your company. Because I think looking at it as a lot of companies in our sector will go out to venture capitalists, and that kind of money that's one way of getting money. But the other way, which is the way we prefer, is debt funding, which is a very different business model and to some extent less risky. We also don't focus, and we don't think you should be focusing on creating novel hardware. The glasshouse industry, especially in Holland, has been growing plants under glass for a very, very long time, and they're very successful at it. And that equipment is essentially commodity equipment, and it's just about how you piece it together. If you piece it together in a novel way, if you're good at operating, if you're good at using advances in data science and manipulation and gathering of the data, you can get more efficiency out of the same hardware that other people are using. And so you don't need to reinvent the wheel. With what we do specifically, it's just about the operations and the combination of that stuff. But at scale, if you can get to a large enough scale, the prices of the products that we're making are actually totally competitive with open field stuff at the moment. Maybe not the bottom end of the market, certainly, but definitely with what's considered organic produce, and closer as we scale up as a business and as our industry scales up in the UK, alongside the sort of middle tier of sort of commoditized vegetables and herbs. And as more people do it, and as there is more market demand, and as unfortunately the world gets worse and the climate gets more terrible, and as more supermarket shelves go empty, there's more investment from the hardware companies to make the hardware that we need to use cheaper. For example, lighting is getting more efficient and cheaper year on year, and they wouldn't be doing that if people weren't buying those lights. And we work very closely with our sort of hardware partners on that sort of stuff. So I think, again, we're at the start of this process. We're not at the end of this process, and everything looks to me as if it will become cheaper and cheaper. We just happen to be at a stage where it's not as cheap as it's going to be in 5, 10, 20 years time.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And Laurent-David, you're obviously thinking about this every day in your role. So I'd turn it over to you for sort of like just tying this together and closing, at least on the scale question.
Yes. So typically, when I hear the word cost, two things coming to mind to me is really what is the baseline and what is the time frame. Because typically, when you don't pay for the externality that you create, then you're likely to have a new solution which does take into account is going to be more costly. So that's what we see is like is almost like the total cost of ownership or the total value of ownership, which has to be taken into account when we talk about cost. Today it's too much fragmented. And that's one problem. The other problem is time, because as Didier mentioned it nicely, it is very important to understand if it's on cost because it's the beginning of the story, like the solar panel example that he gave, or it's structurally going to be more expensive, in 10 years from there, 15 years from there, which is a completely different problem. Because if it's a transition because of time, I would say, then we come back to your question earlier on of what is the role of the government, of the legislator. They can help and support the transition. And then, because of that, helping the cost to go down by as Matt was saying, scaling up, and then you address the time issue. Okay, so that's at the end, cost is baseline and time, and of course, then the decision is somehow a bit easier to take, right?
Yeah, no, thank you. I feel like that's an equation now that's in my head. We just like add it up and see what's the way to go. Is it a structural issue or not? But just in closing, I think just want to say thank you to everyone. This is really only the beginning of the discussion, as we're thinking, of course, not just in terms of the technologies, but really, scratching the surface of the issue and where we want to go from here. But there've been some really interesting ideas and concepts that have been sort of discussed, but also different and interesting ways of thinking about it. How do we evaluate cost? What's the role of regulation? Where does government come in? How can we manage incentives and subsidies in particular in order to encourage some of this? And then particularly also thinking in supply chain terms, right? Like, what are the externalities there? Can we shorten it? What are the ecosystem issues that we need to be considering as we go forward? So, just again, like I said, thank you very much. Really scratched the surface, but very interesting discussion. Thank you, Didier. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Laurent-David. And finally, also thank you to our audience for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed the discussion, and we've got a lot more to come. Please stay tuned for the next session and have a great day.